On today's episode, we're going to be reviewing Joel Webbon's assessment of dispensationalism. Webbon has become a leading voice in the neo-postmillennial movement, and you're going to be very interested to hear what he has to say about dispensationalism.
This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining.
Welcome back to the Bible Sojourner. It has been a while since I've recorded an episode, so happy to be back in the saddle, as it were. I always enjoy putting together an episode and seeing what happens, seeing if anyone else enjoys it. Regardless, it's kind of fun to do, so I just hope these things are helpful. Before we jump into today's episode, I did want to mention that I actually just finished, and it's just out now, a booklet called Artificial Intelligence and the Christian. I've actually had the privilege of doing some presentations for various churches on the subject of artificial intelligence and how we as Christians can use it, and what we should be aware of, and introducing people to the idea. I'm sure many of you are already really familiar with it, but it's a 60-page booklet that is kind of meant to just be an introduction to how Christians should think through the issues and maybe how to use it, and then what to be aware of in the church, just because there are some dangers that are coming because of it as well. And so if it's helpful for you, feel free to pick that up on Amazon or some of the other bookstores, wherever you get books. Just a little 60-page booklet, which will be out of date within a year because just how fast technology is changing. So if you're interested in that, pick it up. Otherwise, don't pick it up. Totally fine. We've done some episodes in the past on it where I've covered a lot of the material, but there's a couple of new things that I've put in there as well. Okay, so on to today's episode. We are going to be talking about Joel Webbon and his comments on dispensationalism. So this actually was done, this interview was recorded at the end of July on the Auron MacIntyre show. Auron, I think is how you say it. It's A-U-R-O-N, the Auron MacIntyre show. And he's a part of the Blaze Network. And I've never heard of him before. I just had paid attention to a bunch of the different post-mill groups on Facebook and whatnot. And so this interview came across the feed, as it were. And so I said, hey, I always enjoy listening to critiques, seeing what the other side's saying. Now, like I said, I don't know much about Auron MacIntyre, but apparently as part of the Blaze Network, he is, a thought-provoking journalist who has this media show where he interviews people or talks about current events, things like that. And so I'm not exactly sure how they were connected, Webbon and MacIntyre, but MacIntyre apparently viewed Webbon as an authority or an expert on the issue of dispensationalism, and so they decided to have this interaction. MacIntyre, I think, apparently from the interview, it sounds like he comes from a military family, very conservative, and so, yeah, never heard of him before, but he has quite a following, and so this interview gets a lot of traction, as it were, so I think it's helpful to review. Now, Pastor Joel Webbon, I've had my eye on him a little longer. He came into my sphere of influence, I don't know, probably like 2 or 3 years ago, just because people had started to pass me some of his links, talking about some of the things that he had done. And listen, I mean, I've had a wide range of opinions expressed to me about him, and some of them really good, some of them not so good. And I think the thing we need to acknowledge is that he is basically viewed as one of the leading voices in the social media world, and he represents this kind of neo-postmillennial movement. And so I think, reviewing what he has to say can be helpful, even if, as I will say, I don't think his arguments or the things that he says are very good. We'll talk about that. But it's helpful to respond to videos like this because he is, in many ways, the people follow individuals like this, Joel Webbon. And so a little bit about him. This is just from his Right Response Ministries website. So he's the president and founder of Right Response Ministries. He's the senior pastor of Covenant Bible Church, which is located on the north side of Austin, Texas. And he's the husband of Megan, father of Olive, Ruth, Eleanor, and Franklin. So 4 children. Now, as far as I know, I've tried to do a little digging, but I can't find much on his theological background. I don't know what he has done for training. In fact, I'm not sure if he's had any. I know that he went to a school called Christ for the Nations, which is a Pentecostal school in Dallas. And so Pentecostal schools basically mean like no training, basically. So a Pentecostal school in Dallas, and then I think he finished his degree at Dallas Baptist University, but I'm not sure what his degree was in. I'm not sure if it included any original languages, Greek, Hebrew, or anything like that. I'm just not sure. But I can't find anything about seminary or anything like that. And so and again, hey, Charles Spurgeon didn't go to seminary, but as will become evident in the interview, I think that some of the things that he says, may have been said differently had he gone to seminary and been challenged on some of these ideas. And so we're gonna talk about that. But as far as I can tell, I don't think he's had much theological training in how to argue or present ideas or anything like that. But regardless, it can be helpful because he's viewed as popular in these ideas. So I don't think these are the best arguments, but I think they are helpful in walking through these issues. So again, this is the interview from the end of July. I think the date is 7/31/2024. And then it's called The Problem of Dispensational Eschatology with guest Joel Webbon. So we're going to jump in and just hear what they have to say, and Lord willing, make some helpful comments along the way. I'm starting the video at 9:24 because the intro is basically just an introduction to who they are and things like that. You can go back and watch that if you'd like. But this is Joel Webbon's response when Auron MacIntyre asks him to define dispensationalism and explain where it came from. So pay attention and listen to how he talks about this.
Century, you were a dispensationalist before you were even a Christian. Like the old joke, like I was a Baptist before I was even a Christian. Well, likewise, it would be true in the same sense that you were probably a dispensationalist and probably are a dispensationalist, even if you have never heard the term. So dispensationalism is the idea. Dispensationalism comes from dispensations simply meaning eras or periods of time. And so the idea is that you can kind of chop up the Bible. One of the verses that they would use out of context is, rightly dividing the word of truth, and so can you as a theologian, as a biblical scholar, rightly, and accurately chop up the Bible because there's all these dispensations and like all theologies, there's a spectrum of, different nuances and different, particular subcategories, but in general, dispensationalists would say that the Bible is divisible into categories of time, dispensations, and in each of these, God is, in a sense, they would nuance it a little bit more, but essentially God is changing.
Okay, we're going to stop it there for just a moment and talk about some of the ways that he was defining dispensationalism. Now, I should say this, and I'm hoping he would agree with me on this, that everybody agrees that there are dispensations. I was just rereading Spurgeon's lectures to my students, and he's just always talking about dispensations. Nobody ever says Spurgeon is dispensationalist, but he's just talking about different time periods. Every single person that I know organizes Scripture into creation, fall, redemption, and then eternity, right? So you have at least 4 periods or epochs of time, right, where God is doing specific things, okay? So that idea is not unique to dispensationalism. It's not the defining mark of dispensationalism. And I think maybe in the past there have been individuals who have tried to make more of those dispensations. In fact, I want to talk about this a little bit later, but I was even thinking Darby himself actually rejected, the 7 dispensations, or he thought that was incorrect of how to understand Scripture. So it's funny. A lot of people just attribute it like all this to Darby, saying Darby is the one who came up with this. Well, it's not true. And it's also true that Darby himself actually rejected a lot of the ideas behind dispensations. But regardless, one of the things that we need to understand is that, dividing the word, as it were, into different periods of time where God is doing specific things is not unique to dispensationalism. And it's not the hallmark for dispensationalism. Now, at the very end is what the thing I want to really key in on, because he said that dispensationalists would nuance this a little bit more, but basically God is changing. And okay, I think it's a little disingenuous to say that dispensationalists would nuance that a little more, because most dispensationalists, if not all, I'm giving the benefit of the doubt that there's maybe some wackos out there, But most dispensationalists would reject entirely the idea that God can change, right? I mean, that's just basic theology 101. So already off the bat, this seems like not a good faith critique of dispensationalism to say that we would say God would change. If nothing else, at least put it in our words, dispensationalist definition, put it in how a dispensationalist would define it, and then you can critique it and say, but what they're really saying is that God changes. So be it. But no dispensationalist would ever say that God changes or that there's a plan A and a plan B. Again, maybe there's some crazies out there that do say things like that. But the majority of, reputable dispensationalists who write or think on the subject are not going to say that God's changing, can't make up his mind, that, he just decided, well, I was going to do this, but now I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to do it. Obviously, even a lot of the thinkers in the early dispensational movement, when it started to catch fire, they were coming out of the Calvinist tradition. And so just, kind of an assault on God's sovereignty would be very offensive to them. And obviously, I know that there are plenty Arminian theologians that would claim dispensationalism, so that's different today, so be it. But the reality is that at the outset of the systematization, Calvinism and God's sovereignty were at the fore, and even Arminians today, I think that they would probably, although I'm not an expert on Arminianism, I definitely think that they would object to the idea, at least they would attempt to say that God is not changing, although that can be a debate for sure. But the reality is that it's a little disingenuous to claim these kinds of things, that God is changing, can't make up his mind, etc. So I think it's important to say that up front, but let's see what else he has to say here.
God is doing one thing in the garden before sin enters the world with Adam and Eve, and then he's doing another thing after sin enters the world, and then he starts, kind of another project with Abraham, and then another project with Moses, and maybe a little side project with Noah in between, and then David, and then the big idea is the New Testament is this entirely severed, separate, divorced. And that's where you get guys like, Andy Stanley, well, it's the New Testament is all that matters. I'm a New Testament Christian. We need to unhitch from the Old Testament, and then, consequently, you unhitch from traditional marriage and you unhitch from sanity and everything else. And so it's.
Okay. Am I hearing that right? So he's saying that Andy Stanley is a dispensationalist, and I'm assuming that he's saying that Stanley is an example of like the primary problems with dispensationalism. But the reality is that Andy Stanley, well, first of all, I'm not sure. I don't know. I think a lot of people would just say Andy Stanley's not like a genuine Christian. Like perhaps he's even in the category of false teacher. That seems to be obvious with the direction that he's going in what he's doing with his churches and rejecting God's design for marriage and all those things. So yeah, that seems really low to say that he's a dispensationalist. And I'm not even sure if it's true, honestly. My understanding of Andy Stanley's theology, which I'm not an Andy Stanley expert, but he seems to be in that group which is very people pleaser / apologetic oriented. Now, those aren't the same thing, but basically he takes different viewpoints as to their apologetic facility in how he can argue. So for example, he prioritizes the resurrection of Jesus over, almost all other evidence or ways of thinking, saying that's the most important thing. And then also, I haven't confirmed this, but multiple sources that I've seen assess his theology says that he actually takes a preterist view on the Olivet Discourse, which again is not the normal dispensational viewpoint. So I'm not exactly sure. Like, I'm just confused if I'm assuming Webbon is saying that Andy Stanley is a dispensationalist by how he's saying is that, oh yeah, this is just what you get with Andy Stanley. And yeah, I just think that's wrong. I don't think Andy Stanley is a dispensationalist, but even if he was, there's crackpots all over the place. In fact, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking to myself, okay, Joel, if we were going to talk, like, let's say we were having a conversation, do you think that it's really fair to just take the worst of everything and bring it out? Are you saying that there's no bad apples in covenant theology? You go down the list, right? Friedrich Schleiermacher, he's the father of liberal theology, like such a stalwart Reformed theologian. And, here he is sowing so much doubt about the Word of God and all of that. I mean, he is literally labeled the father of liberal theology, not exactly what you want associated with your tradition of covenant theology. And you could go down the list with all the post-millennial liberals that have gone to liberation theology and all of those kinds of things. The point is, listen, if I'm being fair, I'm not going to go into the trash and bring out the worst individual and say, this is exactly what covenant theology produces or something like that. That's garbage. Like that's not literal trash and garbage. Interesting. Freudian understanding there. So it's one of those things where, no, we don't do that. That's not how Christians argue. We don't look for the lowest possible, person who believes something. And again, I'm not even sure Andy Stanley would claim that. But we don't do that. We don't say, Andy Stanley is the perfect representation of dispensationalism, just like I wouldn't say, and a good example of that, I mean, this is kind of off limits because it's so fresh, but I think it's important to talk about. Are we allowed to say that Gary DeMar is the perfect representation of what postmillennialism is? Now, if those of you don't know, Gary DeMar was considered one of the foremost defenders of postmillennialism and theonomic postmillennialism, but he went off into heresy land, now denying any bodily return of Christ or the resurrection. And so that makes him a heretic according to Christian tradition. And so is it okay for me to say, look at Gary DeMar, and he is the, perfect example of what postmillennialism leads to, or covenant theology? Obviously, that's not fair. Just because somebody believes in covenant theology doesn't mean they're going to wind up to be a heretic. And so it's same way. You can't do that with dispensationalism. It's just let's be fair, okay? Let's be fair. That's all I'm saying. And I'm trying to point out the bad logic here. And again, just a challenge to Webbon if he ever watches this or listens to this. I'm not sure if he ever will. He probably doesn't have time. But just to those who are listening, we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard of arguing and thinking. And this is just very sloppy. For a Christian leader especially, it's egregious. And so we need to be thinking better about how we argue these kinds of things. All right, continuing on, we are at the 11-minute, 17-second mark.
It's this very segmented, severed, separated and divided theology, and as it pertains to the New Testament, that's the big dispensation. We've been in this 2,000-year moment, dispensation, era of time, but all it really is it's a parenthesis. It's this parenthetical moment where God has this original and primary plan for the nation state of Israel, that are his chosen people. But Israel, because they rejected their Messiah 2,000 years ago in the earthly ministry of Christ, God decided to have a separate, a B plan. And so we've been living for these past 2,000 years in this 2,000-year-long parenthetical era moment where God is doing something with his stepchildren. He's doing something with the church, but he's really excited about Israel. And
all right, so I think the most likely scenario here, as I'm watching this and we're listening to this together and evaluating this, it seems obvious to me that Webbon has not done any research into dispensationalism whatsoever. I'm not sure why. I'm not really sure why he's talking on dispensationalism. I'm not sure what qualified him, or maybe they're just friends, and so MacIntyre wanted to have him on. I'm not sure how that conversation happened, but it seems obvious he hasn't actually read any dispensationalists. He seems to be just repeating some of the same old arguments that we've talked about before on the podcast, and which make no sense whatsoever. If you were just to read, Michael Vlock, my dear friend and colleague, if you were to read Larry Pettigrew, Paul Henneberry, you get on the list, Craig Blazing, Darrell Bach, all these guys, right? I mean, you would not hear this kind of language. In fact, I'm really excited for the newest book that Henneberry is coming out with. I read an advanced copy, and he just talks about this issue in great terms, just talking about how it's the most ridiculous thing in the world to think that there's a plan A, plan B, that the church is a parenthesis or whatever. I mean, the Old Testament is filled with prophecies about Gentile salvation and all of that. So to say things like this is really kind of ridiculous. And I'm just, again, not sure. I'm assuming it's just ignorance. I mean, that's what it has to be. The only other alternative is that he's trying to deceive people, but why would he do that? It seems like it's just ignorance. God's always had a plan for the Gentiles. He's always he's always included that plan, even in the covenants and the prophecies. So, I think that's just a lot of times people who are trying to critique dispensationalism, they just don't have a firm grasp on the Old Testament. And so again, I don't know, if Webbon has done studying in the Old Testament or not, but I mean, it's very clear that the Gentiles are found there. Every dispensationalist talks about God's plan for the Gentiles and how he saves them. I mean, it's just very clear. So, and also he goes on to say this in multiple places, but he talks about how the church is viewed as like a stepchild who's not really important, and people in the church who believe in dispensationalism think that they're second best, or that they don't really, God doesn't really love them. They're just, the stepchild, and the real child gets everything. And listen, I don't know anybody like that. I suppose you could find somebody who believes all sorts of wacko stuff, right? But the whole point is, these are the classic straw man arguments, which nobody believes. Like, it just has no bearing on reality. In fact, as I was watching the video, I was like, yeah, it's weird because there are so many positive receptions to these kinds of comments, just because people, don't know. And so they're saying, oh yeah, if that's what dispensationalists believe, then of course we hate them and we don't like that. But then there were a few people that were saying, and I thought it was funny because they said, yeah, I wouldn't listen to Joel Webbon on dispensationalism. This is just straw manning and there's no, basis to what he's saying. I'm like, at least one listener on the MacIntyre show understands what's going on. And so it's one of those things where, yeah, the reason we're doing this is just because it's a popular show. Webbon is a popular personality, but I think it's important to just show we need to hold people like this accountable. And the way that he's representing dispensationalism is definitely not how any dispensationalist would represent it. And fair-minded critics as well would say, yeah, that's not how this should be understood. But again, if he's never had any interaction with, how to present arguments and interact with people, okay, but this let this be a critique of his critique, as it were, and hopefully challenge him with regard to that. Now, I want to jump forward to 1309 and talk about the comparison between covenant theology and dispensationalism. All right, so he talks here about how theological points have counterpoints, and I think this can be helpful to think about too.
So how does this differ from what the church had taught before? What was, before dispensationalism came along, what was the understanding or relationship between God and Gentiles, God and the church, and God and the nation state or biological people of Israel?
Right. So just like any philosophy or ideology, theology likewise has counterpoints, and so within the theological framework, continuationism as it pertains to the gifts of the Spirit would be the idea that the gifts of the Spirit, supernatural sign gifts, continued today, things like miracles, or prophecy. And then the counterpoint would be cessationism, that certain, not all, but certain gifts have ceased. Well, likewise, as it pertains to dispensationalism, the counter theological movement and viewpoint is called covenant theology.
I just want to make a note there before we go on, because I don't really want to say too much about that. But a lot of times dispensationalism and covenant theology are portrayed as being, the either or categories. But that's so simplistic. There are so many people who don't agree with dispensationalism or covenant theology. And so, I just think, and not to press him too hard on this, because I think a lot of times we do talk in these categories, but it's actually not sufficient to say that it's either covenant theology or dispensationalism, or these are the two only counterpoints or whatever. In some cases, there are point and counterpoint, but dispensationalism did develop within covenant theology, and then it quickly departed as the hermeneutics were actually the main dividing line. So as a system, you do have people who are inconsistent in the system, and just admittedly, you do have some people who are dispensationalists that would hold to like a covenant of works or something like that because of the covenant theology influence in their own life and things like that. And so that, I think, is true, that there's a lot more overlap, at least early on in the systems. But as it quickly becomes associated with hermeneutics, then they diverge a lot. But just because somebody has a good hermeneutic doesn't mean they're going to be dispensational. Dispensationalism doesn't have a monopoly on having a good hermeneutic. It's just an intrinsic part to the system. So a lot of the people that I really benefit from would never claim to be a dispensationalist, but they have amazing thought on hermeneutics, right? But they also wouldn't claim to be covenant theology, because covenant theology is kind of, a enclosed theological system that's driven from the system rather than a hermeneutic. Obviously, that's a debated point. We can talk about that. But the point I'm trying to make is it's not like a covenant theology versus dispensationalism thing all the time. Although dispensationalism's influence definitely has been very powerful over the last 100 years or so. So I think that's what he's mainly trying to say. But again, I just want to point out the way he's saying it is a little inaccurate, but that's the way it is. All right, keeping going.
And covenant theology is the predominant view of the church that was held all the way up until about the mid-19th century. So about 1,850 years.
All right. Now, I know Auron MacIntyre is a media personality. He's not, I don't hold him to a standard of saying you need to be a theologian, you need to know your history and all this. But Webbon is the guy who's supposed to know this. Okay? To actually say, and he's had years to figure this out, presumably. I mean, he's been a Christian for a while and he's been in pastoral ministry for a while. I mean, this would be the kind of thing that would get, sorted in seminary as you had your church history classes. But nobody believes that covenant theology was the dominant philosophy for, 1800 years, right? That is so anachronistic. And now he goes on to say, even if it went by different names or whatever, now that is very misleading, because the whole concept of covenant theology actually undergoes an entire systematization. And this is well proven both by, dispensational historians, covenant theologians, the neutral parties, as it were. You can't get away with this kind of fallacious argumentation. You can't say, oh, covenant theology was always the foundation and then dispensationalists came along and disrupted that. That's just not true. In fact, in Dr. Pettigrew, Larry Pettigrew, he wrote that book, Forsaking Israel. There were a couple other contributions by other authors, but his primary analysis was consulting primary sources and secondary sources from Reformed historians, like Peter Lilback, who one of the things I appreciate about Peter Lilback, he's the president and church historian resident expert at Westminster. And he wrote a book which I think it was called The Binding of God, if I remember correctly, The Binding of God. And so this is a Reformed covenant theologian who's doing a historical analysis of John Calvin and Calvin's contribution to covenant theology. And so basically, and I really have appreciated Lilback's contributions in church history. Just really, really good job overall. I might have quibbles here or there, as with anybody, right? But the reality is that Lilback's historical analysis would, completely disagree with what Webbon is saying here, is that there was a key component of Calvin in systematizing covenant theology, which, by the way, he's instrumental in that, but it's not finished. It's not a finished process by the time Calvin gets done. So to argue that covenant theology exists prior to, in fact, even Lilback actually talks about the initiator of covenant theology as a system is actually Zwingli. So I'm going to say something I don't think I've ever said before. I don't know if anyone has ever said this before, but Zwingli is the Darby to covenant theology that Darby is to dispensationalism, at least as far as the main characters for how they're often pictured. It's obviously not a perfect representation. But the reality is that Zwingli, and we've talked about this on the podcast episode, I wrote a book about Zwingli and his influence on covenant theology and how covenant theology was implemented to defend infant baptism. So all of those things are well established, well documented, right? So the question is, why is Webbon saying that covenant theology has been around for 1,850 years or whatever? That was the primary system. I mean, that's just that's such a egregious historical inaccuracy and it just comes off. Obviously, I don't blame MacIntyre. He probably doesn't know, so he doesn't know how to correct. Plus, I mean, realistically, is it the job of the show host to correct your guest at every point in turn? Probably not. I mean, it's just an interview, so I don't blame him at all for that. But realistically, Webbon should know better than to make such an egregious mistake. Realistically, but other people make this mistake too, so it's worth making this comment. Is that a lot of people think that dispensationalism is the new kid on the block, and they say, well, look, dispensationalism came out of nowhere. It's so brand new, therefore it can't be correct. But the reality is that dispensationalism as a system basically follows covenant theology by 200, 250 years, give or take. And, it's funny because a lot of people that are making these critiques are the post-millennialists and the neo-postmillennial crowd at that, who say that we're in the beginning of the church. This is just the beginning of the church age, and so we're going to be around for hundreds of thousands of years. And so the irony is that, well, wait a second. You believe that we're at the beginning of the church, and you think that covenant theology has far surpassed dispensationalism with regard to age when it's only like 200 years older, at least as far as a system. I mean, it's really kind of ridiculous at that point. And so I think it's helpful to point people out to that reality, is that we're not playing games with saying like, well, covenant theology is 200, 250 years earlier than dispensationalism, so therefore it is more accurate or trustworthy. And just in case somebody says, well, the system was systematized, but there were people who believed the components of covenant theology throughout history. Well, guess what dispensationalists would say as well, right? I mean, come on. I mean, if you're going to play that game, that's the game everyone plays, right? Everyone argues that, so we have to, in a congenial discussion, assume that for the sake of the argument. So we assume that people have believed certain things in covenant theology even before it was systematized. We assume for the sake of the argument, and we can find those things in different aspects of church history, and we can find, I just have been pointing people over and over again to the work by William Watson, Dispensationalism Before Darby, the book edited by Corey Marsh and James Fazio, those books talking about the dispensational system before dispensationalism, the components of that are found throughout church history. This is well documented over time. Okay, so we all make those arguments. It's playing the blame game of dating dispensationalism so late. I mean, it's just, again, it's a terrible argument. I'm not sure, why we still use those arguments, but it's been repeated so often, people do that. All right, continuing on at 14:14.
You have covenant theology, even if it doesn't go by that particular name. That's the reigning dogma of the day until really just the last 150 years. And covenant theology, as distinct from dispensationalism, is the idea that God has only ever had one plan.
All right. Is that distinct from dispensationalism? I am often labeled a dispensationalism, or I'm often labeled a dispensationalist, although I try to fight against the title because I just want to take the Bible for what it says. But I would say, every dispensationalist that I know, including myself, would agree that God has only ever had one plan. So, again, let's be fair in how we represent these things.
God doesn't need B plans or C plans. He doesn't need contingencies because he's God and he's sovereign over all things, and nothing happens ultimately that comes to him as a surprise or a shock or a wrench in the gears. And so God's plan was always the church, and the church doesn't replace Israel. That's, for the record, you may be familiar with that term, replacement theology. That term was coined as a pejorative. It's meant to intentionally demean covenant theology, because covenant theology is not that Israel is replaced by the church. It's not replacement theology. It would be better described as fulfillment theology.
Well, yes and no, in the sense that replacement theology actually was coined by covenant theologians. Like, they actually would say things like the church has replaced Israel. And this has been documented so many different times. It wasn't actually, which, if you think about it, if dispensationalism doesn't exist using, their categories until much later, until the 19th century or whatever, then these theologians that describe themselves with replacement terminology can't be responding to dispensationalists. They're just saying what they believe. And so covenant theologians have often fallen into what we would categorize them as supersessionists. They believe that the church has replaced Israel in a variety of capacities. There's different nuances of what that exactly means, but that's not a pejorative term. Covenant theology has positioned itself to understand replacement theology in those terms now, because dispensationalism was so effective at saying, hey, it is actually kind of ridiculous to think that God would replace Israel with the church, that they've had to kind of change the language to talk about that. And whether you use the idea of fulfillment language or replacement language, I use, and I would encourage everyone who listens and watches this to use the language of fulfillment theology, not to cause needless offense. But it's funny, you use that language, but then all you have to do is just ask, well, what do you mean by that? At what point did the nation of Israel stop receiving the promises and the covenants? At what point did that cease to be the case? Because at some point, you actually see this in biblical history. The church is not the nation of Israel, and nowhere could you say that that's true. And the covenants were given to the nation of Israel. Paul actually makes that explicit point in Romans 9. To them, talking about the Israelites, belong the covenants. So to follow that train of thought, Paul, even while the church is in full bloom, as it were, is saying that the covenants belong to somebody else, not the church, but to the nation of Israel itself. So how do we balance that? At some point, covenant theology, in most cases, there are happy exceptions to this who have believed in a future for Israel, but a lot of covenant theologians would say that at some point, the nation stops being important and the church starts to receive the primary importance. And so, yeah, you don't have to call that replacement theology, but in essence, what you're saying is that at some point the nation loses its significance in the covenantal program of God. So whatever you want to say, you want to call that fulfillment, so be it. But the reality is that we're just describing what is taking place in the theological system. And now the idea that it's pejorative, again, I don't. Covenant theologians use that term of themselves. So, I don't think it's necessarily disingenuous or pejorative to say that that's what's going on, since that is what's going on. But like I said, I use the term fulfillment language just because that's what everyone else wants me to use, and I'll do that. But it is actually interesting, that did bring to mind Webbon. I don't even know if Webbon knows this, but it is actually interesting that dispensationalism is actually a pejorative term. That's actually the detractors of dispensationalism actually started calling the premillennialists dispensationalists. And so they, and this has been well documented historically, but none of these individuals put that forward as, hey, this is what we want to be known as. It was just kind of an anti-system label that was put on people that started to teach these things. And so it is kind of funny that, it's ironic in one sense that dispensationalists actually are the heirs and recipients of a pejorative label. And I don't know, they don't really make a stink about that anymore. But then replacement theologians, if I use that term facetiously, they reject that, even though they themselves used replacement language earlier on in their descriptions of the relationship between the church and Israel. It's kind of fascinating. Now, again, there's obviously broad spectrum of agreement. Even within covenant theology, you had lots of people believing that Israel would return to the land and receive their due restoration as per the covenants. And so even within covenant theology, it wasn't a strict across the board replacement theology. But I think it's fascinating to point those things out. All right, I'm going to jump ahead now to 2310 to address where did dispensationalism come from. So this is the response that Joel Webbon talks about when talking about, okay, well, where did dispensationalism come from? Kind of what's the historical background? And here we go.
Community. What is the history behind that switch? Where did dispensationalism come from? And how did it become the dominant theology of many people today?
Yeah, so Joseph Darby was the individual that coined a lot of dispensational theology.
All right, obviously, hopefully most of you recognize this, but it's not Joseph Darby, it's John Nelson Darby. And again, I think this is an easy mistake to make, but I do feel like I'm doing one of those YouTube channels where you just tabulate all of the inaccuracies in the interview. I think this is an innocent one because I think he's already starting to think about a comparison he wants to make with Joseph Smith. And so he's just calling him Joseph Darby, but it's actually John Nelson Darby. So just so everyone's clear, that's what's going on.
And he was a very charismatic individual, not just speaking of his disposition and personality, but in his theology. He speaks of somewhat similar to like Joseph Smith, like having supernatural moments of, divine revelation, that typically whenever you break the mold, whenever there's a historic tradition, and then all of a sudden, you introduce something novel, it's usually the argument for why your novel idea should be accepted is because of some kind of divine revelation. So whether you're Joseph Smith or whether you're Darby, it's this idea that God spoke to me uniquely, and so he coined a lot of the dispensational theology.
Okay, so I want to address some of that a little bit here. Now, again, I don't like that he's not really bringing in specifics at all. Basically, what he's claiming, big picture, is that John Nelson Darby is essentially equivalent to Joseph Smith in claiming special revelation for his viewpoints. And again, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that, earns you the big fat F in class, right? If you're going to make these kinds of accusations, you better bring the receipts. You got to cite your sources. And this is just one of those things where it's clear that he's never read Darby, but to be fair, I don't think a lot of people have. I've actually been reading a little more Darby just because I'm like, hey, I got to actually see what he says. But there have been some great biographies that have been coming out recently. I've been soaking up a lot of interviews by Crawford Gribben, for example, who is not a dispensationalist. He wrote for Oxford University Press, and he's come out with some biographies of Darby. And so there's a lot of accessibility to actually understanding Darby's life now. And so there's really no excuse to make these kinds of errors, to claim that Darby is producing things novelly through special revelation, claims of special revelation. I would just say, okay, what is novel about Darby's system? And one of the things that I think we would have to admit, if you're just looking at the evidence. Well, of course, I'm assuming that somebody's going to be objective, but if you're objective in looking at this, you're very hard pressed to find anything that's actually novel with Darby. It's very, very difficult to find Darby being the originator of anything. Maybe there's something. I'm sure there's something out there. But usually when people are talking about dispensationalism, they're talking about things like dividing the Bible into dispensations, or they're talking about the secret rapture. And it's actually interesting because Darby actually, we have good history on how those doctrinal teachings came about. And I have here some quotes and some references from Crawford Gribben, who I mentioned. He wrote this, just came out this year, actually, in 2024, this biography of John Nelson Darby. And it's a great work. I mean, he's been interviewed on a bunch of podcasts. You can search him and find a lot of his work. He's a very pleasant, easy to listen to, engaging guy, and it's great. So I encourage you to look at a lot of his stuff. And on his interview with Al Mohler, I copied his quote from that because a lot of people think that the idea of dispensations, arose with Darby, but this is what Gribben said to Mohler when Mohler was talking to him about this. He said, the idea of dividing redemptive history into 7 stages predates the 19th century. It's there in the 18th century, and arguably it's in the 17th century. So remember, Darby is born in the 19th century. So Gribben is saying that this idea of dividing history into 7 stages is actually found in the 17th century. Okay. Again, this is a non-dispensationalist historian. So he's saying, listen, you can find this in the 17th century, no problem. And so he says this, Darby understands that in some of his earliest writings, he speaks about this idea of dividing redemptive history into 7 stages. He doesn't teach that. Okay, get that. He doesn't teach that. He doesn't believe that. In fact, he doesn't want to call these stages dispensations either. Okay, so that's actually very fascinating. If you're thinking about it, Darby is associated with dispensationalism, but Darby himself actually is pushing back. He would reject that kind of labeling of dispensations being important. And so, it's kind of fascinating. Now, obviously, there's a lot to Darby that we could talk about, but I think that that's one of those examples where, okay, Darby often gets misunderstood. And, I think even what becomes a hallmark of dispensationalism for a brief time, those 7 dispensations or the arguments about how many there are, Darby actually wasn't a big fan of that to begin with. But I think what a lot of people are thinking about when they talk about Darby creating something and being novel is this idea of the secret rapture. And so that too, in fact, I think Webbon is probably specifically talking about that. But again, if you just do the research, there's a lot you can find on this, and I think Gribben again is really helpful. But just to set the stage, a lot of people, even some well-known people like Martin Lloyd-Jones, actually bought into this idea that Darby invented the idea of the rapture after talking with a girl who had a prophecy. I think her name was Margaret MacDonald, if I remember correctly. And she was a part of the Catholic apostolic movement. And so she was, giving prophecies. And this was a prophecy that Darby got and said, oh, that sounded great. And so he invented the rapture or whatever. Well, it's interesting because that viewpoint, and so this is Gribben giving some helpful insight on this again, non-dispensationalist, but he kind of gives us a helpful analysis of this. And I just wish people like Webbon would read these sources so that they could actually see what's going on. And so Gribben actually shows that, there was some animosity, antagonism within the Plymouth Brethren movement. And the primary opponent for Darby was Benjamin Wilson Newton. And Benjamin Wilson Newton had a cousin by the name of Samuel Prideaux Tregelles. Okay, Samuel Prideaux Tregelles. And basically, Tregelles was the one who came up with this propaganda that Darby had received this through special revelation. And it was actually another one of the Brethren contemporaries, William Kelly, who was a contemporary of Darby. He was the one who actually collected a lot of Darby's writings, and then he would edit them and make them, readable in many ways. And so William Kelly was essential with that. And one of the things that Gribben notes is that Kelly actually got a copy of Tregelles's pamphlet here, which was talking about Darby's, invention of the rapture or whatever, and made some notes to talk about why we know this isn't true and things like that. And he basically was annotating Tregelles's work and said that it's a well-known idea that the idea of the rapture actually can be traced back to Thomas Tweedy, who was a missionary to South America in the Brethren movement. And so he came from Ireland, I think it was, but he was in South America for a while as a missionary and then came back. And he had convinced Darby and others that this was the best way to interpret Scripture. Okay? So again, it's just now... Again, I just think that these are historically available, accessible facts. And, I just really appreciate people like Gribben who have gone through the writings, they've gone through the historical analysis and done that research and said, hey, look, within the writings of the people themselves, this is where they're saying the idea came from. And I think that that's helpful to understand. But you can understand, obviously, if you have this, need for antagonism and you're trying to discredit Darby, it would be an easy thing to say that he gets it from some, girl prophet in this, anathema movement or something like that. But that's pretty typical with how, even, the world works today. I mean, we often try to discredit people by saying they get their ideas from fallacious sources or things like that. But my main challenge is this, okay? Like these are historically reliable understandings. Like we have the research, we have the documents, they're available to us now. And so I would just encourage people like Webbon or you as a listener or viewer, just do that research, do that understanding, go the extra mile. I mean, don't just take the clips, the YouTube shorts or whatever. I mean, this is about the truth, and we want to be as faithful as possible. But to say that Darby received all of these novel ideas through special revelation is just so disingenuous and fallacious. And so it's kind of interesting at this point, Webbon has said dispensationalism is primarily marked, the best examples that he gives are Andy Stanley and then Joseph Smith. Like those are the two comparisons he makes. And listen, obviously Webbon runs in a world where he gets no pushback whatsoever because that's just not how you win arguments. Like people who are convinced by the arguments Webbon is making are people who just have never heard an alternative viewpoint or never even thought about doing research, okay? And again, I'm not saying Webbon is a representative of the best arguments. I'm just saying that these kinds of arguments are really embarrassing to the cause of Christ. And so we need to have, as my good friend and colleague Bookman would say, unpleasant conversations like this sometimes, where we challenge one another, saying, "Listen, you can't get away with these kinds of things. You can't talk about these kinds of issues." But we're not done. Webbon makes another assertion here, which I think is important to look at.
As a framework, but then another gentleman named Scofield, he ended up doing some, his kind of most significant work was writing a study Bible, and that was somewhat unique for the time. It's not as though that concept had never existed. A Bible that also included commentary in addition to the God-breathed text. But Scofield, his commentary, his study Bible was staunchly dispensational. And so any verse, that historically would have been interpreted in a different way, he would, interpret all of them. All of his commentary of every verse in the Bible would be through a dispensational frame of thought. And that project was funded, without trying to be unhinged here, but just, sticking to the history, it was funded by Zionist Jews. And
okay, so I obviously agree that the Scofield Study Bible was extremely influential, and obviously it was a very important work, and definitely popularized Bible study and even the dispensational viewpoint. No problems with that. But it's becoming very popular among Reformed Christians even to lay blame at the feet of Zionist Jews for the dispensational movement. And this is really kind of concerning in many ways. So I have a couple responses to this. On the one hand, I would say, okay, if, for sake of argument, the Zionist Jews did provide financial help to Scofield for publishing this Scofield Reference Bible, who cares? Okay, who cares? All right, that would be one of the answers to really bring up, is that has no bearing on whether something is true or not. And it appeals to conspiracy theory individuals who are trying to find some hidden knowledge or hidden insight into, did you know that this actually is funded by Zionist Jews who wanted to support the dispensational system or whatever. And the reality is that has no bearing on whether or not it's true. Okay, so just think about, even biblically, who funded the Israelite return from the Media-Persian Empire to the land of Israel, to Jerusalem? It was Cyrus, right? Now, are we going to say, whoa, Cyrus funded the return? He completely funded the return and the rebuilding attempt of the temple. And whoa, Cyrus did that. He's an unbeliever. Now, he also had his own motives for doing that. We know archaeologically that was part of Cyrus's MO, is that he would often return people to their land. And part of the motivation for that was to try to make people more complacent, saying hey, if we give you, if we return you to your land, then you'll be happy about that, and then we'll have a more peaceful empire. That kind of deal is an interesting philosophy of leadership. And so Cyrus is doing that, and are we to discount that? I mean, who cares? Who cares? The Lord can use unbelievers to do whatever He wants, right? So, yeah, this argument is really a red herring as far as a distraction. It has no bearing on the actual issue. And so at the outset, we need to understand that is, if Zionist Jews did help fund the Scofield Reference Bible, well, big deal at that point, right? But here's the real thing: is I want to be faithful. I want to do my due diligence. I don't want to leave any stones unturned, as it were. And so I tried to research this as best I could, because, hey, if people like Webbon, Webbon's got a loud voice, right? He's got the followers, he's got the channel, he's got the platform. So if he's saying that Zionist Jews have, and he's just saying, I don't want to be unhinged, I just want to say the facts, that this is what happened. I said, well, it better be readily available. I mean, this is going to be obvious then. And I searched high and low. I consulted my history books. I asked my friends who were in the history fields. I asked my academically reputable friends. I'm just saying, help me out with this. Give me something. Is there anything about Jews funding the Scofield Bible? And you know what always came back? Crickets, crickets, crickets. And I want to give you what I did find, because I think that this could be helpful. I would love to have more information. I mean, I want people to point these things out to me, but that's the thing is I haven't found anything. Nobody has pointed anything verifiable for that. So what I did find by going back to the original sources, there's a guy, Gabeline, who actually was a contemporary of Scofield, who actually wrote a history of the Scofield Reference Bible. Okay, so he's got some good things to say. So he actually talks about the funding of the Scofield Reference Bible. So this is a source from the time of Scofield, and he's talking about the funding of it, and he lists 4 individuals that are involved with this, okay? So he lists Auron Ball Jr. of New York. He lists John T. Perry of Chicago, John Boos of St. Louis, and Francis E. Fitch of New York. Okay, so those are the 4 individuals that I was able to find in researching high and low for all of this. And best I can tell, I've tried to research as much as possible. Nothing Jewish about them. Their names are definitely not Jewish, that's for sure. There doesn't seem to be any Jewish ancestry in those names whatsoever. Nothing that I could find about them was Jewish. But according to multiple sources, the 2 individuals most prominent in funding the Scofield Bible were Perry and Ball. Okay, those are the two men, Auron Ball of New York and Perry of Chicago. So basically the background to that is in 1902, Scofield, making these connections, basically becomes convinced he needs to resign from the pastorate and start working on the study Bible. And so he does that in 1902. And then you have Gabeline, who helps him secure the funding from these individuals for that project. And then you have Fitch, not Finch. You have Francis E. Fitch, who actually is the primary guy who helps handle the publishing for Oxford. And so, yeah, I mean, I just don't see any evidence whatsoever. Like I went and I looked. I mean, Webbon is saying this is a slam dunk argument. But again, I think this is just kind of ridiculous to make these kinds of appeals and expect people to believe you if there's no kind of evidence for that. Now, the thing that may be going on here, I don't know. I can't get into the mind of Webbon, but there was a video that was circulating earlier. Tucker Carlson did an interview with John Rich. And I want to bring that up because it's just a short little 1-minute clip, but he actually, and we won't watch the whole thing, but it's actually an attack on the Scofield Reference Bible and basically saying that it was involved with the Rothschild family. So maybe that is what's at view here. And I'm going to just play it quick so we have it in our minds here. I'm actually accessing this on Twitter. Where I found it was a guy by the name of Luigi, Orthodox Luigi. And in his post, he says, "Ever wonder where dispensationalism comes from? The Rothschilds funded the distribution of the Scofield Bible. The Rothschilds push a narrative that results in Israel benefiting from American evangelicalism. Shocker. This is my shocked face." And it's not a shocked face. It's obviously, that's what we should expect. So, in other words, this is Orthodox Luigi, apparently, as far as I know, is entrenched in the Reform movement. I don't know him very well. But this is the video that he posted. It's a short video of an interview with John Rich and Tucker Carlson. So this is from the top, and I don't know how far we'll go. We'll see.
What you're saying is the Scofield Bible, its theology is deceptive.
A very wealthy, very charismatic preacher named John Darby came with this doctrine that's now referred to as the secret rapture or the pre-tribulation rapture. And guess who he was connected to, by the way? The Rothschilds.
Interesting.
Have you ever heard of a Scofield Bible?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so C.I. Scofield was basically a student of John Darby, and he adopted that part of the doctrine, and he incorporated that into the Bible. It was the first Bible ever made that had study notes with it. It became so popular, every Christian was reading it, every minister was reading it, including me, including my own father, for a long time. That's what we believe too. But when you start actually going back and reading line by line by line what is said that will be leading up to Jesus coming back, which is when the rapture happens, it's the inverse of what John Darby put down.
All right, and then Tucker Carlson goes on to say that, he always kind of had some suspicions about that, and that it's kind of a shame that the Scofield Reference Bible has caused us to send our people to death on behalf of Israel, etc. So a bunch of conspiracy arguments for that. And so the big thing I want to key in on there is that you seem to have John Rich saying that the Rothschilds were somehow involved in the production or the distribution of the Scofield Reference Bible. And so maybe, I don't know, maybe Webbon just heard that and said, oh, well, that must be true if Tucker Carlson is allowing that on there. I don't know. And so I tried to find evidence of the Rothschilds being involved, but there's basically no evidence. And so I turned high and low, and I actually found, so from the perspective of the Scofield Reference Bible, I found nothing. But then I started to look into the history of the Rothschilds, and I found an expert on the Rothschild family. He actually has written some books on it, and I'm going to bring up his website here. Mike Rothschild is his name, ironically. And I don't know what kind of, I assume there's some sort of relationship there, but he's written on the family history, and he wrote a blog post about this issue. So this is his site, Mike Rothschild. He's a journalist, claims to be an author, conspiracy expert. So he actually has some books on the Rothschilds family, and they seem to be well researched. So he actually wrote a response to this Tucker Carlson interview. And, there's more that we could read on this, but I just want to zoom into this part. He talks a little bit about the background of the Scofield Bible, etc. So he says this: Carlson and Rich's claim that the Rothschilds helped create or fund Christian Zionism also don't carry any kind of evidentiary weight. Many Rothschilds were Zionists, of course. And let me take a note there and just say that this is to research the Rothschild family with regard to Zionism is interesting because there were some key players there. But there, as Mike is pointing out here, there's also a lot of divergence in the family, which if you research the history of modern Israel, you understand that there were a lot of people against Zionism within the Jewish community. So he goes on here. So many Rothschilds were Zionists, of course. Many also were not. The family is extremely large and varied in its beliefs and priorities. And so simply ascribing the Rothschilds as having done something is a meaningless statement that only serves to fuel anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And again, we're talking about Tucker Carlson here. Similarly, trying to link the Balfour Declaration to Christian Zionism because it's a letter written by Lord Balfour to Lionel Walter Rothschild is nonsensical. Okay, so his point is that you can't just say the Rothschilds did something without evidence, okay? So, there's a need to be historically accurate here. Now, he talks about the sources here, all right? And the sources are, this is his statement here, the sources connecting all of this together are impossibly thin, mostly consisting of blogs and a few podcasts that throw the accusation out without evidence. The closest thing to a primary source connecting Darby to the Rothschilds and Christian Zionism is a reference to the family in a 2002 issue of Executive Intelligence Review, claiming that the 19th century British aristocrat and premillennial Zionist Lord Shaftesbury was instrumental in the founding of the Palestinian Exploration Fund, which brought the Darbyites and other evangelicals, wealthy Jews like the Rothschilds and Montefiores, together with the highest levels of English aristocracy, if you want to pronounce it correctly, I suppose, to officially claim Palestine for the empire. Now, he goes on to say, regarding that Executive Intelligence Review as a publication, he says, it should be noted that the Executive Intelligence Review is a publication of the crank conspiracy theorist and activist Lyndon LaRouche, or LaRouche, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, and often published incomprehensible and anti-Semitic nonsense, including a 1996 article that was likely the first to connect the Rothschilds to future conspiracy theory magnate George Soros, or as I want to call him, Jorge Soros. So as primary sources go, EIR, that's the Executive Intelligence Review, is firmly in the category of ones that can be ignored. Okay, so what he's saying, in essence, is that he couldn't find any evidence. He doesn't know of any, and the closest thing that you have to evidence is from a publication which is non-reputable, to say the least. And I think that that's par for the course for this kind of argumentation. But, it really brings to mind the problem that we're seeing in some segments of the Reformed Christian community right now. And it's unfortunate and saddening to me because I loosely consider myself a part of that, even though I don't hold to like infant baptism or covenant theology or things like that. Like I really tend to jive well with people who believe in Reformed theology. But what has been happening a lot lately is that there's a grassroots movement, which are led by individuals like Joel Webbon. And it really is, to use Webbon's terminology, more unhinged from reality. And people are clinging on to, conspiracy theories or things that have no factual basis. They're arguing in poorly categorized sentences, fragments, illogical statements, theories that have no basis. Those are the kinds of things that are being appreciated now. And again, I just really want to advocate as Christians, we really need to be proponents of the truth. We need to seek the truth. And that might mean, I know, perish the thought, reading some books, right? Reading some books, reading sources that we don't necessarily agree with, but evaluating their arguments, evaluating their assertions. And so I just, there's so much more we could talk about. This interview isn't even halfway over. There's so much more we could talk about. I don't know. Maybe I'll do a part 2 because Webbon goes on. It doesn't get better, right? It just continues spouting this kind of nonsense. But think about this: we've gone over an hour assessing just this much and just talking about how problematic this is. And maybe I'll do another part. I don't know. I just don't want to. I don't want to waste my time on these kinds of terrible arguments, but I also want to point out to people how terrible they are. Like in no realm could I ever encourage people to follow or listen to Joel Webbon if these are the kinds of standards he uses for himself, right? And again, if Joel Webbon ever listens to this, I would just, try to kindly admonish him, saying, listen, you gotta get your house in order for that. You can't just say these things without backing them up with facts. And it's one of those things where as Christians, we are held to a higher standard. We can't misrepresent each other. We can't, just state things that are controversial without backing them up. Even though that's what gets the clicks, that's what gets the likes, that's what gets, people going in the social media world. The problem is we have a lot of people who are trained in social media use, but they're not trained in Greek and Hebrew. They're not trained in logical thought. They're not trained in thinking accurately about Scripture. And that's my greatest fear, is that, Joel Webbon and people who are like him would create disciples, that are even more unhinged than he is, right? I mean, I'm saying that facetiously, but that is a genuine fear, right? Because people become more than their teacher. The teacher shows the way, and then the students walk the path, right? The teacher shows the way, the students walk the path. And so if you have students that are walking this path, I think even just following some of the things that have been happening with James White and some of the people that have just been, tearing him to shreds because of, his stand on like the Crusades being, Catholic in nature and basically an arm of the Catholic Church and founded in Catholic theology. There's some crazy things happening in the Christian world. And I would just challenge us. We want to be people of the truth, people of the book. And, obviously this was an interview about dispensationalism, but I think it illustrates something a lot more profound and dangerous. And that's that we live in a world that's governed not by seeking the truth, not by trying to be careful about what we say, but actually about soundbite theology, just saying things that get clicks, saying things that we don't have evidence for. As Christians, we should be careful that we don't want to say things that are not true. And if that means saying, well, I can't say that because I'm not sure, well, then we have to go that route, even if it means not getting a few more subscribers or things like that. I mean, that's just what we're called to as Christians. And so we must be people of the truth. We are representing God. We must be people of integrity. And so I just pray that God would help us do that. So I hope this has been helpful for you. It's kind of a tough episode to make for me. I don't really like going after people, but at the same time, I think it's necessary because, these kinds of people have reach. And so I pray that this will be useful to us. If it's not, you can always tell me. You could reach out on my contact form on the website, petergaming.com, and say, hey, you are as unhelpful as anything is unhelpful. You are the most helpful thing that God has ever created. You can say that to me, and I actually won't be offended. That's fine. But if it is, I'd love to hear from you on that as well. You can always reach out through my website. You can find out more about the seminary at shepherds.edu, where I teach, and we have our conference coming up soon. That's the Shepherds 360 conference. You can find out more about that at shepherds360.org, I think it is. A lot of things going on. I thank the Lord for being faithful and would just ask for your prayers as you think of it to just continue to being faithful. That's heavy on our hearts as it ought to be. May the Lord be with you. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you.